By suggesting that he might order a U.S. regime change invasion of Venezuela, President Trump has inadvertently shown why North Korea has been desperately trying to develop nuclear weapons, to serve as a deterrent to defense against one of the U.S. national security state-storied regime change operations. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised to see Venezuela and, for that matter, other third-world countries who stand up to the U.S. empire, also seeking to put their hands on nuclear weapons. What better way to deter a U.S. regime change operation against them? Think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. national security establishment had initiated a military invasion of the Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, had exhorted President Kennedy to bomb Cuba during that invasion, and then had recommended that the president implement a fraudulent pretext, i.e., Operation Northwoods, for a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. That's why Cuba, which had never initiated any acts of aggression against the United States, wanted Soviet nuclear missiles installed in Cuba. Cuba's leader Fidel Castro knew that there was no way that Cuba could defeat the United States in a regular, conventional war. Everyone knows that the military establishment in the United States is so large and so powerful that it can easily smash any third-world nation, including Cuba, North Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Venezuela. Castro's strategy worked. The Soviet nuclear missiles installed in Cuba drove Kennedy to reject the Pentagon's and CIA's vehement exhortations to bomb and invade Cuba. The way the Pentagon and the CIA saw the situation was that Kennedy now had his justification for effecting a violent regime change operation in Cuba. The way Kennedy saw the situation was that a violent regime change operation through bombing and invasion could easily result in a loud nuclear war between the United States and Russia. It turned out that Kennedy was right. What the Pentagon and the CIA didn't realize at the time is that Soviet commanders on the ground in Cuba had fully armed tactical nuclear weapons at their disposal and the battlefield authority to use them in the event of a U.S. bombing or invasion of the island. If Kennedy had complied with the dictates of the Pentagon and the CIA, it is a virtual certainty that the result would have been a loud nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. To his everlasting credit, Kennedy struck a deal in which he vowed that the United States would cease and desist from invading Cuba in return for the Soviet Union's withdrawal of its nuclear missiles from Cuba. The point is this: if the Pentagon and the CIA had not been trying to get regime change in Cuba, Cuba would never have felt the need to get those Soviet missiles. It was the Pentagon's and CIA's commitment to regime change in Cuba that gave us the Cuban Missile Crisis. Equally important, the resolution of the crisis showed that if an independent, recalcitrant Third World regime wants to protect itself from a U.S. national security state regime change operation, the best thing it can do is secure nuclear weapons. Thus, the current crisis over North Korea's quest to get nuclear weapons to deter a U.S. regime change operation is rooted in how Cuba deterred the U.S. national security establishment's regime change efforts in 1962. Americans would be wise to regime change operations in North Korea and Venezuela in the context of the U.S. government's overall foreign policy of military empire and interventionism. Recall, first of all, that the U.S. government has a long history of interventionism in Latin America, where it has brought nothing but death, destruction, suffering, misery, and tyranny. Nicaragua, Guatemala, Chile, Brazil, Panama, and Grenada come to mind. In fact, the situation in Chile that resulted in U.S. intervention was quite similar to today's situation in Venezuela. In Chile, a socialist was democratically elected and began adopting socialist policies, which caused economic chaos and crisis. The CIA and Pentagon intentionally and secretly did everything they could to make matters worse. U.S. officials even engaged in bribery, kidnapping, and assassination in Chile. They incited and encouraged a coup that succeeded in ousting the democratically elected socialist and replaced by a pro-capitalist military general, whose forces proceeded to round up, kidnap, torture, rape, or execute tens of thousands of people, including the murder of 2 Americans, all with the support and complicity of the Pentagon and the CIA. Haven't we seen the same types of results with the U.S. regime change operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere? Death, destruction, and chaos, not to mention a gigantic refugee crisis for Europe. And look at what the pro-empire, interventionist system has done to the American people. Constant, never-ending crises and chaos, with North Korea being just the latest example. Out-of-control federal spending and debt that are threatening the nation with financial bankruptcy and economic and monetary crises. totalitarian-like powers being exercised by the president and his national security establishment, including assassination, torture, and indefinite detention. Weird, bizarre random acts of violence that reflect the same lack of regard for the sanctity of human life that U.S. officials display in faraway countries. None of this is necessary. It's entirely possible for Americans to live normal, healthy, free lives. All it takes is a change of direction, one away from empire and interventionism and toward a limited government republic and non-interventionism in the affairs of other nations. That's the way to achieve a free, prosperous, harmonious, and friendly society.